So let's look at the syllabus modules, very first module. So we have in this course, what is it, 2 tests, which we've now had. I haven't graded the second one, but we've given it. So that is 30% of your grade between those 2 tests. There'll be another test in the finals week. Let's go there while we're saying that. Final exam schedule. It's a Tuesday, Thursday, 3:30 class. So the exam is on Thursday at 4. So that's when we'll have an exam. It will be a somewhat longer period. So we do 75, and this is closer, not quite 2 hours. It will be a longer time for you to do things. Okay. What else do I want to say? So we're expecting one more test. It's just a 1-day test, so it's a longer test, but it's only 1 day. Okay. There's homework, which is 15%, which you've been doing all along, or dump on me just before the test, either way. But and labs, there were 30. And then there's a project, so that's what I wanted to say that you probably haven't been thinking about. I have not been thinking much about, but there's a project in this course. And I will lay out, hopefully before Thanksgiving, a set of criteria, like write an app that does this, 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 and this, sort of some long list of things, and then give you, 4 or 5 points for each thing. And then if you sort of give me the things and do a good job on the things, you'll probably have a pretty decent project grade. So you've been doing, some of the labs have been like, do your own lab, do your own, put things in a spinner and read a JSON file. So it'll be something like that, but it'll be a little bit longer. So it'll be more like 2 labs or something. And there'll be some time probably in the last week to work on that project. So probably that last week, I won't lecture. I'll just say, work on the labs, ask me questions. Okay. So that's the other sort of that last component of the course. It's been there since the beginning, but just remind you that it's in there. Okay. What else? Anything else? Okay. So I put up a new homework, which is to watch a video on how to prepare an app to put on in the store. So you'll write some summary of that, watch it, read, write some little summary. 5 sentences is enough. We'll do it, but you can write more. And then there's a new demonstration, and then a lab reading an XML file. So that's what we want to do today. So let me pull this horse racing thing down. This is this horse racing example we've done before. We did it, I believe, in JSON. And this time we're going to do it in XML. So this will be sort of our 3rd type of data file. We had sort of a normal text file with delimiters, for instance, a CSV file, a comma separated values file. But it didn't have to be commas. It could have been vertical bars or slashes or any sort of thing can be served as a delimiter. Just a comma is a common one. And then we moved on to JSON files, and JSON files had a lot more structure to them in that they corresponded to objects and arrays and properties and so on. And also that, what do I want to call it? That sort of metadata that not just here is, you know, the character, I don't know, Pikachu, but a definition of what property it is, the name of the Pokemon or something like that. So that those files have the data and the metadata built in, and the structure that's understood. What's a property? What's an array? What's an object in a JSON file? And so when we read a JSON file, the information got sort of organized for us because it was already organized in the file. And XML, it's an older format, and it's going to have more structure than like a CSV file, but not be quite as easy to use as a JSON file. So it's a little bit of a throwback, but their XML files are still around. We use them all the time in Android projects. We tend to use them as these design things, as the sort of making our screens. But it's also an older, but still used in some places, a sort of a data exchange format. And so we want to be able to read an XML file. So that's what we'll be doing today. So this is an example. It's, you know, I'll have a list of racehorses and information about the racehorses, and then the user can interact with the interface and display information about racehorses. So I zipped up the main in this case. Let's look at the resources, the res. And one thing we note right away is that there's a new file down here, the XML directory, or the XML folder, and then in there a file. So that's one thing. So I want, so that is, I want to be in here, and I want to make an XML directory in res here. So I'm going res, new directory, make sure you obey our naming convention and have all small letters, and it's XML. And then the file, horse racing XML, which also obeys our naming scheme, gets put in there. So copy that and paste that in there. And that looks like this. We've seen this data before, but we've seen it in a JSON format. Here it is in XML format. And I just used some converter that I found online. And I fed it my JSON and said, make it into XML, which it did. So it has a root element, a root tag, and that is a sort of a standard thing in XML files. It's not absolutely required, but it is somewhat standard to see a root. And there's a tag here that starts the XML file, and that's sort of like a one-off thing, but most of the other tags have beginnings and ends. So root has a close, and then there's something called horses, and that has a close, and then there's something called element. If you remember what the JSON looked like when we did it in JSON, I had an object. That object had a property called horses, and then horses was an array, and it was an array of objects. Now in XML, there's no indication like, oh, this is an object and this is an array, but it is using this, the converter decided to take my curly brackets around a horse that were saying, here's the beginning of an object and here's the end of an object. And they replaced that with these element tags. Now, that's not a standard thing. That's what this converter did. It could say element, it could say item. It's just what this converter decided to do. So the X in XML is extensible, which means that the tags are not standard tags. They're made up as you go. And so this is what this particular thing decided to do with my JSON object, was to introduce a corresponding XML tag called element. But again, it's not a standard. It doesn't have to be that way. It's just that's what this converter did. And then I had properties. You remember what the JSON looks like. I would have quote horse jockey, end quote, colon, and then E maple also in quotes, and then a comma, and then the next thing. But what the converter to XML decided to do was take my properties and turn them into tags, and then take the data and put it between tags. There can be a slight distinction in JSON for numbers. So the 1 and the 9.35 in JSON, you could put those in quotes, but you don't have to. So you don't have to put a number in quotes in JSON. But in XML, everything's just between tags. Now, it's possible for a tag to have an attribute, but the converter that I used didn't do any attributes. So none of my code today is going to refer to the attributes of any of these tags. I'm just going to say, here's the start of a tag, good, and that's that. I'm not going to worry. I have no attributes, but there are things here that you could say, like alt text or something like that. Equals. So it's possible for a tag to have some kind of property, some attribute, but again, in my example, it didn't. So I won't be referring at any spot to attributes, but I just wanted you to know that it's possible for an XML to have them. Okay. So again, instead of working with JSON, we're reading an XML file. The XML file, sorry, the JSON file then I converted had an overall object and had a property horses that was an array. So that's how horses ended up here as a tag, because we're working with XML and it's tag based. And then the horse property was an array of objects. So there's an element, and then there's another element. So each element, so there's no indication that there's necessarily an array, but there is this sort of element, open element, close element to sort of group these together. So it's got it's the similar data. So so you must see some similarity in the structure of the data, but it's just done differently in XML. Okay, so that's what we're going to be reading. All right, and we put it in an XML folder. So if you want to read XML, one of the places to put XML is in an XML directory that announces that it's XML, and then there are certain things that will help us read XML, certain parsers that will help us read XML. So the more you do to announce, hey, this is XML, by having an XML extension, by having an XML directory, by having an XML parser, then there's less for you to do in terms of making up the, for you to do the parsing yourself if you've announced over and over again what is XML. Okay. So that's the new thing. There's a directory called XML, all small letters, and in it an XML file. I didn't do any values. I didn't do any map things. Oh, here's a layout. Okay. So let me get my layout. Standard. Control A, Control C. find my layout here, my hello world, go over to code, and paste it in. Now I got something red here. I have a bunch of red. One of the reds says that there's supposed to be something in drawable. So I have the pictures of what the jockeys wear when they're riding that horse, and I haven't put those in drawable yet. So that's what this complaint is. And then that's a major complaint. Then there are these little complaints that are just annoy the hell out of me. And it used to be layout margin left, and then they switched it to start, but then there's some backward compatible issues. So it wants start and left, and it's a pain in the ass. So I'm just going to ignore that, and it's going to work. Okay. But what it really wants is me to repeat all these and have start and left for the older ones and start for the newer ones, and I should have both. And it will run, even though that looks like it's red and there's an error, that will run. Whereas this drawable thing is more of an issue. So let's get that taken care of. So I'm back here. So I did the layout. Let me get those drawables. Here they are. I'm highlighting all these JPEGs. I'm going to take this guy out. Copying. I just sort of took a working project. So they all obey the naming scheme. And what am I doing? Copying. And then I'm going to right click in drawable here, paste. Now that took out the problem with the drawable. There is now a file in here called affirm.jpg with the resource name affirmed, and so that one red went away. Okay, so that's a nice pink and black jacket there. Okay, what else is there? So there was the XML folder with the XML file. I didn't do anything in values. I didn't do anything in map. I copied over the layout. I copied over the drawable. I'm done with resources. Let's go over to code. Okay, and there are two code files here, a horse.kt and a main activity.kt. So this is, again, more like the, even though it has the sort of metadata in there, it's a little bit more like when we had CSV files, in that JSON, it's understood. There's a curly bracket and that means object, and there's a square bracket and that means array. And so when we read JSON, it knows exactly what to do with it. When we read XML, it's a little less certain. There are some fancy XML libraries. We're just doing something fairly basic and standard, so we're going to do some of the work ourselves. But there's some fancier things that you can do with XML and have it more sort of interpret things based on the file you like, the way JSON works. We're going to instead work more the way where we say, I want to make objects out of these things. Oh, I better know what the property names are. So I'm going to sort of read the JSON file, read the XML file myself and see what the properties are. And then the values of the properties might change, but I'm going to assume that the tags, that the property names don't. And so I'm going to explicitly use them in what I do. Okay. So here's the XML. And here is this element, really sort of corresponds to an object. And so here are the properties of my object. I have a jockey and a name and a rank and a rating and silks and sire and trainer and YouTube code. And so I'm going to have something that corresponds to those things. In this example, I'm not going to name them the same thing. So I'm just going to have something that corresponds to all those things, but I might change the name. If you want to do it more sort of, if you want to work your way towards a more automated thing, then you might want to keep the names the same, but I didn't keep the names the same. But I have, let me open my two KT files here. Started them off in Notepad. Here's the horse activity. And I have properties for each of those properties that I saw in the XML file. I have properties in a class that I called horse. So I'm going to go, I lost my project viewer, view. That's easier. Okay, so instead of, I can drag, I'm not going to drag the file over here, but what I'm going to do instead is right click on this com example demo 1116B, and I'm going to say that I want a new Kotlin class, and that classes, the standard is to start with a capital letter, and so I'm going to have a horse class, and then the class has a package, and so like our normal copying KT, it's sort of like everything but the package. So I'm going to copy everything but the package, paste it in, or I could just paste in the interior of the class, either way. Here's my class called horse in my file called horse.kt, which I right-clicked and added a Kotlin class to this, to where in the same location where main activity is. I have properties. There's a jockey for the horse, a name, horse name for the horse. I don't like to use the word name. The word name is often like a reserved keyword. So that's why I didn't just say name. Like I'm afraid of the word name because it might be a keyword. So I simplified things. I didn't say horse jockey. I just decided to say jockey. But horse, I kept with the horse. I kept horse with the name because I was afraid of reserved words. But then there was a rank and a rating and a silks and a sire and a trainer and a YouTube code. And those are the things that we saw in the file. And the order doesn't matter. There's certain little things where it can matter, but I probably have the same order because I probably said, oh, here's my file, and I was looking at my file as I was making the class. I don't have any explicit constructors here, and I'm just, when it comes time to use it, I'm just going to use a trivial constructor. I'm just going to make a horse with empty, when I say I'm going to make a new horse, it's going to be sort of empty parentheses and just be a trivial constructor for the horse, and then I will add the properties as I go. So I didn't make a constructor. I just said, here are the properties I will have for a horse. Then let me go to the main activity and copy that code, everything but the package. There we go. Copy everything. Paste over here, everything but the package. Okay. And now let's start looking at the main activity code here. And it's mostly going to be parsing the XML file. So here I made a list of, so I have an array list of the type horse. So when I make a class, I'm making a type. And so I said I want an array list of things that are of my horse type. So when you have these things in the angle brackets, then you are saying what type of thing they are, and I'm going to have a bunch of horses. Okay. Then I do connect to the interface. So I had a text view for the sire and the trainer, and an image view for the silks, and a button to go over to a YouTube clip. and a spinner for the horse names. Just our standard connect to the interface kind of stuff. I'm going to have an array of just horse names to work with my spinner. So I have these objects, but I want some simpler array just to use to populate my spinner. So that's what horse names is for. Okay. Now the reading of the XML. So here is me going to the resources. There's specifically within resources a getXML method. And then I am going to the RXML horse racing. That is that file we put over there in XML. So this is announced sort of doubly that it's XML. We're using a getXML method. It's in the XML folder. And then also, although the file extension is not shown here, we know that that's an XML file. And it does have an XML extension. The event type is, we're going to read a tag, and it is going to give us, when we're working our way through XML, we need to know what kind of a thing we have. And that is what this event, many things I know, I just closed the only one thing I did want to look at. So that's what the event type is as I'm reading the XML file, what type of a thing did I just read? And I'm going to have a list of items, and I'm going to, and when I make them, I'm going to increment some kind of counter. And depending on when I increment the counter, I'm either probably going to start at 0 or -1. And the way I happen to be doing it, I'm starting at -1. Because the first thing I do is make a horse and increment the counter. And then I want to, then when I've made my first horse, I want to be at 0, not at 1. So that's why I'm starting at -1. Up here with the event type, I'm starting at -1, just so that it's I have a while loop down here on event type, and I just want to make sure I'm not at the end of the document. So all this is anything but end of document. So long as I'm not, so whatever number I pick, it just better not be the number that corresponds to end of document. I don't know what number that is because they've given me a constant I can use, so I don't need to know the number. But all I care is that -1, that number is not -1, which is not. Okay, so I'm in a while loop, and I'm going to keep going through the while loop until I hit the end of the document. That's the purpose of the while loop, to keep reading. And you read XML, sort of, you walk through it. And so when we had text files, we sometimes read them like all in one shot. We just sort of like, sometimes you sort of read all the file. We did various versions. We read it all and just made it one big clump of text. We read it line by line and read one line at a time, or we read it all at once, but we made an array of lines. XML, you sort of read sort of pretty much like tag by tag. Okay. So long as I haven't hit the end of the document, I stay in my while loop. Then the whole while loop is just one great big if. Here's the end of the while loop, and here's the end of the if. So there's one huge if in this while loop, and I'm saying that I'm only going to do stuff when I have a start tag. So when I'm in XML, I have a start tag, I have some stuff between the tags, I have a closing tag, and I'm just going to, in terms of the structure of my loop, I'm going to start some kind of action when I encounter the start of a tag. I have this thing next, then I can move to the next thing. So it's not that I'm just only interested in the starting of the tags, but I will explicitly push myself through to like to the next thing. And but if I'm on an ending tag, my if just ignores everything. All right. So while I'm not at the end of the document, if I'm at the beginning of a tag, let me get the name of my tag. So I'm reading the document till I get to the end, and I read sort of little bit by little bit. If what I just read is a start tag, then I'm going to proceed, and then I want to know what was the name of the tag. So I just read a tag, what was its name? And I'm going to work with these inner ones, element and horse jockey and something. But if I have root, I'm going to pretty much just ignore it because it's not in my when. If I have element, I'm going to ignore it. It's not in my when. But these ones I'm not going to ignore. I'm going to do something for. Okay. All right, so that's where I am so far. Read the file, saw if it was the beginning of a tag, if it was a starting tag, and if it was a starting tag, what's its name? And then I have a big switch statement, a big when. If I'm making a new object, the way this file set up, again, this is not all XML files. I use some converter and it made these tags called element. So this word could change depending on what converter I use. Okay. But this one happened to use the word element. So if I run into element, then I'm going to add a new horse. So here's me making a horse. I'm using my class name horse, open close parentheses. So I'm using a constructor. I'm using the trivial constructor. So I didn't make this constructor, but a trivial constructor comes along when you make a class. So I'm making sort of a horse, which is empty, and I'm adding it to my list of horses. And I'm incrementing my index, which started off at -1. So now I'm on the first horse. So the first horse is going to get an index of 0. Now I have an index of 0. Okay. And then I just keep, let me jump down to the bottom of the when. And I go to the end of the, here's the end of the when, here's the end of the start tag. Here's me pushing on to the next part of the XML file. Next, parser is what's reading the file. Next pushes me to the next thing. And so that thing before I get to the while loop keeps pushing me through the file. Okay. So if I run into element, I make a new horse, I add it to my list, I increment my counter, my index. If the tag that I encountered is a start tag that says horse jockey, I'm going to move myself to the next thing. The next thing is going to move me from horse jockey, the tag, to what's inside the tag. This is the next thing. XML is extensible. You can have tags within tags within tags. So we don't necessarily, I know because I've looked at the file that what's in here is text. But in principle, Kotlin as a generic language does not know that what's next is text. It just thinks it's the next thing within XML. It could be a tag, it could be text, who knows? But I say, if my tag was horse jockey, let me move to the next thing. And then I know that that next thing was text. So give me the text of the parser, and I'm going to make it the jockey property of the horse I just made. So the horse I just made is my list square bracket, my index. And so I just got the name of the jockey, whatever it was, E something or other. And then I move to another tag. So moving in this case to the closing tag. But I don't do anything with closing tags. So that's just going to get me through my while loop and nothing's going to happen. If I read the next tag and it's horse name, okay, so I move beyond the tag that says horse name, and I use the text of that and make it the horse name of my object. And then I'm making a separate little array of horse names because that's what I'm going to use with my spinner. So I stopped off here and did that. And then I move on to the next thing in the array, which is the closing horse name tag. What if the thing were horse rank? Well, then I move to the next thing, which is the rank of the horse, which is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, what have you. And I make that the rank of my horse. But what it read, it assumes to be text, and so I have to cast it as an integer. My class said that the rank was an integer, so I must cast it. And then move to the closing tag. If the tag was horse rating, I move to the next thing, which is the data. I'm going to read in that data after I cast it as a double and make the rating of the current horse. And move to the next tag. Silks is easier, it's just a string. So move to the next thing, make that the text of that next thing the silks property, and go next. Sire is easy. Go from the tag to what's inside the tag, make that text the sire property of the horse, and move to the next tag, which is the closing tag. Trainer and YouTube code. Just all more of the same. There's the bottom of my when, there's the bottom of my if I'm working with the starting tag, and I'm always only doing things with the starting tag. Here's me moving, forcing myself to move to the next thing to keep moving through the file. And here's my while loop. When I hit the end of the document, my while loop stops. So I've now read the XML file. And I made my own object. So if it were JSON, you just say read the JSON. It makes the arrays and the objects for you. When you're reading XML, then you have to sort of make your own objects and add the properties sort of more explicitly. Okay. Now I'm finally done reading the file. Let's get down to the business of making our app do something. So I have an array called horse names. I use it to populate the spinner. Give myself a spinner event. So when the user chooses a new horse, I'm going to remember when I work with a spinner, I get an index out of it, an I, and so I'm using my list, which is my set of horses, I, sire, and that's one of my properties, and put that, make that the text of the text view for the sire, and the same thing for the trainer. Now, I think it was in my other class, but I'll say it just in case it was one of you guys and I'm confused. When I was looking through labs and grading labs and homework, I have somebody who's like taking objects and turning them into parallel arrays. And that's sort of like moving backwards. Like we started off with lots of parallel arrays because it was an easy place for us to start. And I'll often do like a little parallel array to populate my spinner, but I shouldn't make like tons and tons of parallel arrays. That's not really sort of a proper way to be coding these things. You want the information that belongs together to move around together, and that's part of one of the reasons we have objects. So that was just not a good idea. You know, it works, simple. You didn't have to learn much beyond what we did with in week, 3 or 4, but it's, not going to get you a job at, probably not going to get you a job at all, let alone the job at Google or something that you might want. Okay. Here's our usual silks. Now the silks property, you always have to look at this a little bit. The XML, the silks, was already sort of a drawable resource thing. So these, what came in this property for the horse silks was already small letters, did not have a file extension, so I don't have to do much work. I don't have to move it into lowercase. I don't have to eliminate spaces or put in underscores or eliminate any kind of dash or hyphen or anything like that. So these are already convenient, but that's not always the case. So right here, it's simple. Take the silks property, look it up within the drawables, get an ID, and then use that ID to put something in the image view for silks. But you've seen other times when this required some work, some like string manipulation, some kind of get rid of spaces, put it in the small letters, get rid of the file extension. It's just not the case here, but that's just because this example happened to be convenient, but it's not always. So sometimes there's more work here. Sometimes I make your life easy and you turn around and go back and make your life hard. But know why you're doing the things, and then you'll know when you have to do it and when you don't. So if you looked at the silks properties, they were all nice, simple resource names, all small letters, no spaces, and no file extensions. So I could just work with them directly. But there are other times when we needed to do some string manipulation. Our standard on nothing selected that we need, even though we never put anything there. Here's the clip. We had, I don't know if I ever ran this thing, probably not. So we've seen this thing before. It has a drop-down list with horses. We pick a horse. It shows us information about the horse, and there's also a clip. So I'm showing the sire and the trainer, and here's the silks, that image, and then what horse do I want to pick? And then go over to YouTube and see some ads, of course. Okay. But if I weren't so much in a hurry, I could, after the ads, there was a YouTube video on the horse Damascus. Okay. So you remember in the button clip, when I'm in the spinner event, it hands me the index, but when I'm in the button click event, I have to get the index. But there's something for that selected item position. That gets me the index from the spinner. And then I wanted the YouTube code property, YTC. The YTC in this case was a YouTube code rather than a YouTube full URL. There were examples in, I think, either lab or a homework or on the test where I gave a full URL, and then that was confusing people because the example was only a code and they had to add the base URL to the code. In this case, I did give you a code, so you do have to add some base to it. But pay attention to what the data looks like. If it's a full URL, then I use it as a full URL. If it is a code, then I add to a URL, then I have to do some concatenating. This is one where I have to do some concatenating. So here's the concatenating to make the URL. So this brings up the intent. I don't know if you remember or not, but to go to YouTube as a new intent did not require us to edit the manifest, the Android manifest. If I were showing you a picture that I got off the internet, I would need to give permission to the app. But to just have this new intent thing sort of pop over, that's just me using some part of the phone that already had access to the internet, so I didn't have to give access to the internet. But if it were more sort of internal, if I were showing you a picture or getting you data off the internet, then my app would need permission to the internet, but not for this intent thing. There's the bottom of my on click. There's the bottom of my on create. There's the bottom of my main activity. So that example's done. Let's show you what you have to do, which is fairly similar. Short XML, short films. That's a category like the Academy Awards. This is an old test. And it used combined XML and checkboxes. So I gave you some things, blah, 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 blah. Okay. What are you supposed to do? You're going to read an XML file that I used the same converter for it. So it does have the same element thing, but there was a country, a director, an image, a producer, runtime title, winner, writer, year. So make a class with that information, parse the XML file, and then make objects, make an array list of objects of this type of short film, whatever you want to call your class. You should not call it horses. That would be absurd. So people will. Crazy. All right. Then, so this first part up here is pretty much the same. So there's a drop-down list. I gave you one little extra little doodah thing to do in that if the movie won the Oscar, then you're supposed to put a star next to it. But choose a movie, show the picture, display the information, and then also generate a set of checkboxes for the movies. I have that in 2 columns. So I have linear layout set up for you to put it in 2 columns, but add checkboxes based on your array. And then the person can make a sort of a little film festival for themselves by checking certain films, and then you will add up their runtimes and say, oh, if you were going to watch Bow and Deer Basketball and Animal Behavior, that would take 27 minutes. So just some good old checkbox review. I taught previously, when I taught XML earlier, and so this was a test that combined XML and checkboxes. Okay. So that is that. Okay. So that's what you're supposed to do. Any questions for the